Picture this: a king who redefined marriage 6 times, invented divorce English style, and literally rewrote the rules of an entire religion just to get what he wanted. But here's what they don't teach you in school. Henry VIII once wrote love songs that made grown courtiers weep, collected more shoes than a modern influencer, and had such a sweet tooth that his teeth turned black by age 40. Welcome back to Epic Renaissance, where we dive deep into the scandalous, the sumptuous, and the absolutely bonkers world of history's most fascinating figures. Today, we're unraveling the real Henry VIII. Not just the wife-chopping tyrant you know, but the Renaissance prince who was Shakespeare before Shakespeare, the gourmand before Gordon Ramsay, and yes, quite possibly history's most extra monarch. Trust me, by the end of this video, you'll never see this Tudor titan the same way again. Let's start with something that'll blow your mind. Henry VIII was never supposed to be king. He was the spare, the backup plan, the just-in-case prince. His older brother Arthur was the golden child, destined for greatness, married to Catherine of Aragon in a lavish ceremony that made royal weddings today look like courthouse affairs. But fate had other plans. Arthur died suddenly in 1502, and suddenly, little Henry, all of 10 years old, became the most important person in England. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Instead of the typical medieval prince education of warfare and basic literacy, Henry received what we'd call today a world-class Renaissance education. This kid spoke Latin like a native, played the lute like a rock star, and could debate theology with university professors. His tutors included some of the greatest minds of the age, including the famous humanist Thomas More. Yes, the guy who'd later lose his head for disagreeing with his former student. The irony is delicious, isn't it? But here's what really sets Henry apart from other monarchs. He was an athlete. We're talking about a 6'2" giant in an age when the average man was 5'6". Contemporary accounts describe him as extremely handsome, with a powerful build that could tire out 8 horses in a single day during hunting expeditions. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Henry was much handsomer than any sovereign in Christendom, and diplomatic flattery aside, multiple independent sources confirm this wasn't just political brown-nosing. Henry didn't just inherit a throne in 1509 at age 17. He inherited a treasury so full that his father, Henry VII, had essentially solved England's financial problems. The young king had money, looks, brains, and absolute power. What could possibly go wrong? Here's where most history classes fail you completely. Before Henry became the infamous serial husband, he was arguably England's greatest Renaissance monarch, and I'm including Elizabeth I in that comparison. Let's talk about his mind first. This man wrote a book, not just any book, but a theological treatise called Defense of the Seven Sacraments that was so brilliantly argued that the Pope gave him the title Defender of the Faith. The irony practically writes itself, considering he'd later tell that same Pope where to stick his authority. But here's the kicker. Scholars still debate whether Henry actually wrote it himself or had help from Thomas More. Either way, a king who could engage in high-level theological debate was virtually unheard of. But theology was just the beginning. Henry composed music. The man had serious musical chops. He played multiple instruments: lute, virginals, recorder, and flute. Now let's talk about something Henry is rarely given credit for. He essentially invented the concept of royal luxury as we understand it today. This man didn't just live well, he lived so extravagantly that he redefined what it meant to be a king. Start with his palaces. Henry owned over 60 residences, but his crown jewel was Hampton Court. This wasn't just a big house, it was a statement piece that made Versailles look modest. Hampton Court had over 1,000 rooms, including a kitchen complex that could feed 1,200 people daily. The famous Great Hall had a hammer beam roof, so magnificent that visitors would literally gasp when they entered. But here's the detail that kills me. Henry installed over 280 guest chambers because he wanted to ensure that visiting nobles would be so overwhelmed by English hospitality that they'd never forget it. The kitchens alone were engineering marvels. We're talking about 8 separate cooking areas, including specialized spaces for roasting, baking, brewing, and confectionery. Henry employed over 200 kitchen staff. This wasn't just eating, this was performance dining designed to demonstrate that England was a power player on the European stage. But Henry's real obsession was fashion, and this is where it gets truly frustrating. He didn't just wear expensive clothes, he used fashion as psychological warfare. His clothes were literally weapons of mass impression. We have wardrobe accounts that he owned over 55 robes, 15 cloaks. Many of his outfits contained diamonds, rubies, and pearls. His everyday doublets were made from cloth of gold, actual gold thread woven into silk, and trimmed with ermine that cost more than most nobles' annual income. His shoes deserve their own documentary. Accounts state that he would have owned over 40 pairs of shoes. We're talking about silk slippers with silver bells, leather boots with gold buckles, and formal shoes with genuine ruby heels. Henry owned shoes for every conceivable occasion: hunting, dancing, formal court appearances, and even special shoes for playing tennis. Yes, Henry VIII played tennis, and he was apparently quite good at it. In an age when most people owned maybe 2 sets of clothing total, Henry had a walk-in closet that would have made a Cardassian weep with envy. Everyone knows Henry broke with Rome to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry Anne Boleyn. But the real story is so much more complex and fascinating than king wants male heir. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Catherine of Aragon was his brother's widow. In the 16th century, this wasn't just awkward family dynamics. It was potentially against divine law. Leviticus 20:21 specifically states that a man who marries his brother's wife will be childless. And here's what gets wild. After 18 years of marriage, Catherine had given Henry only one surviving child, Mary. Multiple pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, but only one living heir. And she was female. For a Renaissance king, this wasn't just personal disappointment. It was an existential threat to the realm. England had only once been ruled by a woman, Empress Matilda, in the 12th century, and that had resulted in a brutal civil war called the Anarchy. Henry genuinely believed that leaving England to a female heir would plunge the country into chaos. Now about Anne Boleyn. Their relationship wasn't the hot and heavy romance Hollywood portrays. It was a sophisticated intellectual partnership. Anne had been educated in the sophisticated French court, spoke multiple languages, and was deeply engaged with reformed religious ideas. She wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. Henry's love letters to her reveal a man completely intellectually seduced. He writes to her about theology, politics, and philosophy, not just passion. But here's what gets really shocking. Anne made Henry wait for 6 years. In an age when kings could essentially have any woman they wanted, Anne Boleyn held out for marriage. She played the ultimate long game, and it worked. Henry literally changed the course of English religion, broke with a 1,000-year Catholic tradition, and risked war with the most powerful Catholic monarchs in Europe, all because one woman refused to be a mistress. The political consequences were staggering. When Henry declared himself head of the English Church, he wasn't just throwing a royal tantrum. He was fundamentally altering the power structure of Europe. The Pope lost England forever. The Holy Roman Emperor was furious. He was Catherine's nephew, after all. France was torn between supporting their old ally, Scotland, which remained Catholic, and maintaining trade relationships with England. Let's start with wife number 3, Jane Seymour, because she's often overlooked, and that's a tragedy. Jane wasn't just the wife who finally gave Henry his male heir, she was possibly the love of his life. Unlike Catherine and Anne, who were both intellectually formidable women, Jane represented something Henry had never experienced: uncomplicated devotion. Here's an ultimate detail that will break your heart. When Jane died just days after giving birth to Edward VI, Henry was so devastated that he refused to remarry for over 2 years. This was a man who had spent 6 years moving heaven and earth to divorce his first wife. But when Jane died, he essentially went into extended mourning. He wore black for months, which was unprecedented for a king who is usually a peacock of fashion. Now, wife number 4, Anne of Cleves. This marriage is usually played for laughs. The Flanders mare who was supposedly so ugly that Henry couldn't consummate the marriage. But this narrative is completely wrong and frankly misogynistic. Anne of Cleves was politically savvy, multilingual, and by contemporary accounts, quite attractive. The real problem was cultural mismatch and political timing. Wife number 5, Catherine Howard, represents Henry at his most delusional and dangerous. Catherine was probably 19 when she married the 49-year-old king, and Henry was completely besotted. He called her his rose without a thorn, and showered her with gifts that even by Henry's standards were excessive. But Catherine had past relationships and possibly an ongoing affair during her marriage. When Henry discovered this, his reaction was swift and brutal. Finally, Catherine Parr, the survivor. She wasn't just lucky, she was brilliant. Catherine was England's first woman to publish a book under her own name while serving as queen. She was a religious reformer who influenced Henry's religious policies and, more importantly, served as a stepmother who united Henry's 3 children. Here's something remarkable. Under Catherine's influence, Henry restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession. Without Catherine Parr's diplomatic skills, we might never have had Elizabeth I. Now let's talk about something rarely discussed in detail, Henry's dramatic physical transformation, because it's actually key to understanding his psychological development. Young Henry was essentially a Renaissance superhero. At 18, he was described as extremely handsome, fair-haired, and tall. Erasmus wrote that his appearance was so impressive that he looked more like a god than a man. But here's where it gets really interesting. Henry's relationship with food was complex and probably psychologically driven. In his youth, he ate to fuel his athletic lifestyle, but as king, food became performance. Royal banquets weren't just meals, they were political theater. Henry would often eat publicly while conducting state business, and the sheer quantity of food was designed to demonstrate England's prosperity. The turning point came in 1536, when Henry suffered a serious jousting accident. His horse fell on him, and he was unconscious for 2 hours. Modern medical analysis suggests he likely suffered a traumatic brain injury. After this accident, his personality changed dramatically. He became more paranoid, more violent, and his weight began to balloon. By the 1540s, Henry weighed an estimated 320 pounds and had a 54-inch waist. But here's the sad part. His leg injury from the jousting accident never properly healed, probably developing into chronic osteomyelitis. Contemporary accounts describe the smell from his infected leg ulcers as so terrible that courtiers would try to position themselves upwind from the king. This physical decline had huge political implications. As Henry became less mobile and more reclusive, court factions gained more power. The religious reforms became radical, the political persecutions more intense, and Henry's decision-making more erratic. Let's dive into something absolutely delicious, literally. Henry VIII wasn't just a big eater, he was probably England's first celebrity chef. Henry's sweet tooth was legendary and ultimately destructive. He consumed massive quantities of sugar, a luxury so expensive that it was worth its weight in silver. Henry didn't just eat sugar, he was obsessed with sugar sculptures. Royal banquets featured edible castles, sugar roses that looked more real than actual flowers, and elaborate mythological scenes crafted entirely from sweetened paste. His favorite dessert was something called leche lombarde, essentially a medieval cheesecake made with dates, cream, and enough sugar to send a modern nutritionist into therapy. The king's breakfast alone was a spectacle. We're talking about ale, wine, bread, meat, and what contemporary accounts describe as divers preserves. Henry typically consumed more calories at breakfast than most people eat in an entire day. But here's what's really telling. Even as his health declined, Henry continued to host elaborate feasts. Food wasn't just sustenance. It was how he demonstrated that he was still in control, still the magnificent king, even as his body betrayed him. Here's where Henry's story gets really wild, because breaking with Rome wasn't just about divorce, it was the 16th century equivalent of declaring religious independence, and the personal details make it even more remarkable. Most people think Henry just wanted to divorce Catherine and marry Anne, so he invented his own church. But the theological crisis was genuine and deeply personal. Henry was a religious man, not just politically, but spiritually. He heard Mass daily, often multiple times. He genuinely believed that his marriage to Catherine might have been cursed by God, explaining why he couldn't produce a male heir. But here's what's fascinating. Henry never wanted to be Protestant. Even after breaking with Rome, he continued to believe in Catholic theology. What he rejected was papal authority over England. Essentially, Henry wanted Catholicism without the Pope, a very Tudor solution to a complex problem. The personal cost was enormous. Thomas More, Henry's former tutor and friend, refused to acknowledge Henry as the head of the English Church. Their final meeting was heartbreaking. More allegedly told Henry, "I pray God give you a quiet conscience," which was essentially calling the king's decision morally wrong to his face. Henry had More executed, but contemporary accounts suggest he was genuinely tormented by the decision. But perhaps, most tellingly, Henry kept a private chapel where he continued to pray using modified Catholic liturgy until the day he died. He never fully embraced Protestantism personally, even as he imposed it politically. This internal contradiction, revolutionary in public, traditional in private, defined much of Henry's later reign. The Henry of the 1540s was a completely different man from the Golden Prince of 1509, and the transformation is both fascinating and terrifying. After his jousting accident and the execution of Anne Boleyn, Henry became increasingly paranoid. But this wasn't generic royal suspicion. It was targeted psychological terror. Henry developed what we'd now recognize as elaborate surveillance systems. He employed networks of informants throughout his court, and noblemen never knew who might be reporting their private conversations directly to the king. But Henry's paranoia had a weirdly intimate quality. He was obsessed with loyalty, not just politically, but personally. He wanted to be loved, not just obeyed. Yet, even in his darkest period, Henry maintained his intellectual interests. He continued composing music, writing theological treatises, and designing military equipment. This wasn't a man who had completely lost his mind. This was someone who had become convinced that absolute power required absolute ruthlessness. Henry's last years reveal a man desperately trying to control a world that was spinning beyond his grasp, and the intimate details are both tragic and absurd. By 1546, Henry was so overweight that he required mechanical assistance to mount his horse. Court records describe elaborate pulley systems designed to hoist the king into his saddle. But here's what's heartbreaking. Henry continued to commission armor as if he were still the athletic young king. His final suit of armor, made just months before his death, was designed for a man who could no longer walk unassisted. His eating habits became increasingly bizarre. Henry would often demand meals in the middle of the night, requiring kitchen staff to maintain round-the-clock readiness. He developed cravings for specific combinations that sound like pregnancy requests: pickled herring with strawberry preserves or roasted swan with candied violets. Court physicians tried to regulate his diet, but Henry would fly into rages if anyone suggested he moderate his consumption. But perhaps, most poignantly, Henry became obsessed with his legacy. He spent enormous sums commissioning portraits, biographies, and historical accounts that would preserve his reputation for posterity. He was acutely aware that he had fundamentally changed England, and he wanted to control how that change would be remembered. His relationship with his children became complicated and touching. Henry genuinely loved Elizabeth, despite having her mother executed. Court observers noticed that Henry's face would light up when Elizabeth visited, and he would often abandon state business to spend time teaching her Latin and Greek. With Edward, Henry was simultaneously proud and terrified. Proud to finally have a male heir, but terrified that the boy was too frail to survive. Here's something that reveals Henry's humanity. In his final months, he would often ask courtiers to read to him from books he had loved in his youth. The dying king wanted to remember who he had been before the crown corrupted him. Henry died on January 28, 1547, probably from complications related to his diabetes and infected leg ulcers. His last words were reportedly, "Monks, monks, monks," which might have been delirium, guilt about dissolving the monasteries, or fear about meeting the God he defied. Here's what's remarkable. Despite his tyrannical reputation, Henry VIII inadvertently created the foundations for England's Golden Age. His establishment of the Royal Navy transformed England from a European backwater into a maritime power. The ships he commissioned and the naval traditions he established directly enabled Elizabeth I's defeat of the Spanish Armada and England's eventual dominance of global trade routes. His educational reforms, driven by his own intellectual interests, created a generation of brilliant English scholars and administrators. The men who served Elizabeth I, including William Cecil and Francis Walsingham, were products of the educational renaissance that Henry had initiated. Even his religious revolution, motivated by personal desires, had profound unintended consequences. By breaking papal authority, Henry accidentally created space for the intellectual independence that would characterize English culture for centuries. The questioning of traditional authority that began with Henry's defiance of Rome eventually evolved into the skeptical, empirical thinking that would produce Francis Bacon, William Shakespeare, and eventually the scientific revolution. Here's something beautiful. The English language itself was transformed during Henry's reign. Because the New English Church required vernacular worship, there was an explosion of English religious literature. The language became more sophisticated, more expressive, and more capable of handling complex ideas. Henry's personal obsession with controlling religious doctrine accidentally accelerated the development of English as a literary language. And those palaces? They weren't just royal showing off. They were real job creation programs that employed thousands of craftsmen, artists, and laborers. Hampton Court alone required the skills of masons, carpenters, painters, glaziers, and decorative artists who trained apprentices and established craft traditions that lasted for generations. So, what do we make of Henry VIII? He was simultaneously England's most tyrannical and most transformative monarch, a man who embodied all the contradictions of the Renaissance itself. Henry's true legacy isn't the wives he married or the heads he chopped off. It's that he proved monarchy could be personal, passionate, and transformative. He showed that kings could be intellectuals, artists, and innovators, not just warriors and administrators. In many ways, Henry VIII invented the modern celebrity, someone whose personal life becomes inseparable from their public role. The England that Elizabeth I inherited, confident, cultured, intellectually curious, and fiercely independent, was Henry's creation. He didn't just change English religion, he changed English identity. We are who we are today partly because a brilliant, passionate, absolutely impossible king decided that no institution, not the Catholic Church, not tradition, not even divine law, was more important than his personal will. And that's the real Henry VIII. Not just a cartoon tyrant, but one of history's most complex and contradictory figures. A man who contained multitudes, scholar and brute, romantic and pragmatist, visionary and destroyer. What do you think? Does knowing these intimate details change how you see Henry VIII? Which aspect of his personality surprised you most? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed diving deep into this Tudor psychology and palace intrigue, you're going to love what we have coming next. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're just getting started on this journey through history's most luxurious and outrageous moments. Until next time, keep living that epic Renaissance life.